Okay, for this mini lecture, we're just going to be talking a little bit more in detail about Piaget's theory and specifically the sensorimotor period in Piaget's theory. Okay, so Piaget was a major player in cognitive theory and specifically cognitive development theory. And Piaget became interested in thought processes when he was hired to field test questions that were being considered for for a standard intelligence test for children. He worked for Binet and was field testing different questions to figure out, which questions were appropriate for which age groups of children. He was supposed to try to find the age at which most children could answer each question correctly, but he became less and less interested in what children could answer correctly and became more interested in children's wrong answers because he noticed that children of the same age tended to make similar types of mistakes. And to him, that suggested that there was a developmental sequence to intellectual growth. So he did propose a stage theory. He proposed a sequence to intellectual growth. So since it's a stage theory, Piaget thought of cognitive development as being discontinuous rather than continuous. And he believed that how children think is more important than what they know. So it's not just whether you can get a question correct, it's what is the thinking process underlying the answer that you give, so that even incorrect answers are interesting in the sense that there's a thought process that leads you there. And that's what he was interested in finding out. And what he used was the clinical interview approach that we talked about when we talked about research methods to get at this underlying thinking process in children of different ages about different topics. Piaget believed that understanding how people think reveals something about how they interpret their experiences and how they're constructing their understanding of the world. So Piaget's theory is sometimes referred to as a constructivist approach because he believed that individuals construct their own knowledge. They're very active participants in developing cognitively in that they interact with the environment, and through those interactions they construct their knowledge base. And so this is different from some of the other theories that we talked about before, like Freud and Erikson, where children are very passive in their own development. They're kind of at the mercy of parents or the unconscious. In Piaget's approach, children are seen as much more active. In terms of Piaget's approach, let's talk about some key concepts. Schemes or schema is a term that's used frequently in his theory. And a scheme is just a psychological structure that organizes experience. It's kind of a mental category of related events, objects, knowledge, etc. And children use these schema to understand the world. And the basis on which schemes are created is through physical activity in the beginning, and then to more functional and then conceptual to abstract kind of reasoning. And so we'll talk about that as we move through the different stages. But what we're talking about in infancy and toddlerhood is more of a physical activity in the environment that helps children develop these schemes or schema. And so when we talked about Piaget before, we talked about the child who had a scheme or a schema for a pet dog, right? So that's the idea that you kind of have these experiences in the environment and then you form these mental categories, these psychological structures, and that helps you to organize how you're interpreting new information from that point forward. He also suggested that we learn through cognitive adaptation to environmental demands, that we all come into the world with an innate capacity to adapt to the environment cognitively. And we do that in a couple of different ways. We do that through assimilation and accommodation. We've talked about assimilation and accommodation before, so you'll remember that assimilation is where a new experience is simply incorporated into your existing schemes, right? So the child who has a Labrador Retriever and they form their scheme of pet dog based on that Labrador Retriever, and then they come across a Chihuahua, that's similar enough information so that they can just kind of incorporate that information into their existing mental structure. Accommodation, on the other hand, is where you have to modify the scheme in some way based on that new experience in order to understand that new experience, or you might also create a new scheme. Um, And so we talked about that when we talked about the child learning of a bazenji that doesn't bark. And so that required some reorganization of the scheme in order to deal with that new information. So here's the process that's happening. Okay, so we come into the world with this innate capacity to adapt to the environment cognitively, as I said earlier. And what we're striving to do, according to Piaget's theory, is we're striving to maintain a state of cognitive equilibrium. And this is basically you being cognitively comfortable, that you're comfortable that what exists in your head matches pretty well with what you're experiencing out in the world. And if that's the case, if you're in a state of equilibrium, then you have a good balance between assimilation and accommodation, that you're not really doing too much accommodation. Okay, and then what happens is when you come into contact with information that's really different from your scheme, like you learn about a bazenji, that sends you into a state of cognitive disequilibrium, and that is just cognitive conflict, and it's uncomfortable, and it's in the nature of the individual to seek that, to achieve that cognitive equilibrium. And so what you do is you have to spend time accommodating in order to do that, right? That you have to accommodate, you have to organize your mental structure, your schema, in order to deal with the new information. And then once you've done that, that will send you back into a state of equilibrium. So what you see here is a real explanation of the underlying processes that propel us to more advanced ways of thinking in Piaget's theory, right? So unlike unlike Freud or unlike Erikson, who don't really explain how you move from one stage to the next, Piaget is really saying this is the process that underlies that movement across the different stages. The way that we grow cognitively is by trying to maintain this state of equilibrium and engaging in accommodation. Okay, so in infancy and toddlerhood, the stage that we're talking about is the sensorimotor stage. This spans from birth to about age 2. Now, just to give you some backstory on this stage theory, Piaget, when he initially proposed the theory, didn't really care too much about the specific age ranges that went with each stage that he proposed. He was more interested in the sequence, in the order of things. But every time he presented his talk to audiences in the United States, he would get the same question, which is what are the age ranges? At what age are children engaging in these different skills and abilities? And then he also got a second question, which he termed the American question. And the American question is, can we get children to do these things at earlier ages, right? So this sort of fascination with pushing children to achieve certain abilities at earlier and earlier ages. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind, because one of the criticisms of Piaget's theory has been that he underestimated children's abilities, that he tended to say that they could do things at later ages than was actually true. But in terms of whether a criticism is very important and is going to have a major impact on a theory, this one is not all that important, because, like I said, Piaget didn't really have specific age ranges in mind when he first proposed the theory. He just kind of tacked these on as he felt pressure to do. Now, that in and of itself might be a criticism. Maybe he should have done more research or put more thought into it. But as a serious criticism, this one is not so serious. So what the infant is in the toddler is doing during this stage is they're using their senses and their motor skills to understand the world. According to Piaget, children really don't have thought the way that infants and toddlers don't really have thought the way that older children and adults have thought until toward the very end of this stage. So that's interesting to think about, right? And falls within something that would be criticized along the lines of underestimating children's ability. So what he's suggesting is the schemas are really just their physical actions and their sensory experience in relation to the environment at this point. What they are doing is they're focusing on objects in the environment and the actions that they can perform on these objects. And through this activity, they're starting to figure out the relationship between their actions and the consequences of those actions. And that's really important, because the infant begins to discover that they are an independent being separate from others that can have an impact on the environment. Okay, now there's so much happening in this particular stage that it is broken up into 6 substages. And these are all considered different schemes according to Piaget. So that the first substage is reflexive schemes, and this is from birth to 1 month. And this is essentially what we've talked about before in terms of reflexes, that the child is not really voluntarily interacting with the environment in this stage. What they're doing is just learning involuntarily about the environment because of their reflexes in response to stimuli from the environment. Okay, the second substage is primary circular reactions from about 1 to 4 months. And in primary circular reactions, what's happening is the child performs these repeated actions. They accidentally stumble on some kind of behavior and they repeat that behavior again and again. So they discover putting their hand to their mouth and sucking on their hand, right? And they will do that over and over again. What makes these circular reactions primary is that they focus on the infant's own body. So they're not yet performing actions that have an effect on the external environment. They're really just sort of discovering their own body at this point. The third substage is secondary circular reactions, and this is from 4 to 8 months of age. And again, these are repeated behaviors, but what makes them secondary is that they're now focused on objects outside of the body, right? So they are sitting in their playpen and they're kicking their leg and their foot hits the edge of the playpen and it makes a noise, right? And so they discover that accidentally, but then they keep doing it again and again in order to get that same effect. In the fourth substage, you have now a coordination of secondary circular reactions, and this is from 8 to 12 months. And so you're combining these earlier schema in order to achieve some kind of goal. So you might engage in, for instance, reaching and grasping to shake a rattle, for instance, and that would be something that would fall under substage 4. In the fifth substage, tertiary circular reactions, the child here becomes really a little scientist. And that's really essentially how Piaget viewed children. He saw them as these scientists that are sort of independently, individually experiencing, exploring the world. And so they begin to experiment a whole lot with objects in the environment during this time. So you'll see children often dropping objects over and over again, right, to see does something different happen, or they might try the same action on different objects, and they're really just sort of engaging in this trial and error behavior, and it looks like they're engaging in problem solving at this age. So this is around the first time that children start to maybe have the emergence of thought, according to Piaget's theory. But it's not really until the sixth substage that children are capable of thought, the way that Piaget defined it. And this is from 18 months to 2 years of age, and it's mental representation. Mental representation is just the ability to have an internal depiction of some object or event without having to actually view it directly. Okay, so if I ask you to picture the face of a relative, right, that's a mental representation of that relative because they're not actually present. And um, what indicates that they now have mental representation, according to Piaget, is that they tend to come up with these sudden solution to problems. That you're not seeing the trial and error experimentation that we saw in the fifth substage, but they all of a sudden come up with a solution, which indicates that they may be experimenting with actions in their heads, and then all of a sudden, right, based on that internal mental experimentation, come up with a solution. Now, is it really true that toddlers don't have thought until 18 months to 2 years of age? No, I mean, we have evidence that we've already talked about that that contradicts this. Remember when we talked about imitation, and we talked about whether imitation is a reflex or not, and that we said that children, even as young as 4 months of age, are capable of what's referred to as deferred imitation, right? That indicates that if you can imitate an action that you saw earlier at some later time, that you probably retain some mental depiction, some internal depiction of that behavior, and that is showing up certainly much earlier than 18 months of age. So that's one of the criticisms of Piaget. Now, one of the major milestones of the sensorimotor stage is the development of object permanence. And you probably know that object permanence is simply the knowledge that an object continues to exist even though it is out of sight, right? So even if you can't see it, you know that it's still there. What's interesting is that up until about 8 months of age, now think about where this falls in terms of the 6 substages, right? So before 8 months of age, this is prior to coordination of secondary circular reactions. If you present an infant with an object and then you hide that object, the child really fails to acknowledge that the object ever existed. They don't look for it, they don't seem upset that it's gone. It's just really out of sight, out of mind, according to how they're behaving. It's not until about the 4th substage that children are able to find an object that has been hidden in front of them, right? So in the 4th substage of the sensory motor stage, you hide a toy or an object behind a screen, as this picture suggests, and they will now begin to actively search for that object. However, children are not perfect at object permanence yet. At this 4th substage, it's not until a little bit later that they are searching without error. The error that they make in terms of searching for objects at this early stage is called the A not B error. They're pretty easily fooled at this age. So picture this, right? You have one object that you're hiding, okay, and you have two hiding places. You have two cloths, right, side by side. And you repeatedly hide the object, the toy, under one cloth right in front of the child, and they successfully, at 8 months of age, reach for the cloth, grab it, and find the toy. Okay, but then on a later trial, you hide the toy under the other blanket, under the other cloth. And what the infant that's 8 months of age and just starting to master object permanence does is they look for it in the original hiding place, right? They look for it in the A spot, the original spot. And so they're not quite perfect at this as of yet, but by substage 6, they're perfectly capable of not making this A not B error. They won't be fooled by that anymore. So the next thing that I want you to do is to go ahead and pause the presentation on the next slide, and there's a link to a clip that shows this A not B error. Okay, so go ahead and pause the presentation now and watch the YouTube clip that demonstrates the A not B error, and then return to this presentation. Okay, so it's fun to see kids behaving that way, to see some kids in action making those kinds of errors. Now, what I want you to think about is, what is required of the child to be able to demonstrate their knowledge of object permanence using a task like this? Because this was the task that Piaget devised, and this is what he based, the theory on through his observations of this particular task. So what does a child have to be able to do? Well, they have to be able to reach. They have to be able to grasp, right, to find an object using this particular approach. And so maybe this is a confound, right, that maybe children do have an understanding of object permanence prior to 8 months of age, but they're not able to demonstrate that because their motor skills aren't so great as of yet. Right, so this harkens to the American question: can children actually display this ability at earlier ages? And there's been lots of research devoted to this question. Right, so the argument is that infants display a wide array of understanding earlier than Piaget suggested, that he underestimated their ability, and that it's probably related to the procedure that he used. And so the goal was to develop a new method to reveal different kinds of findings. And so that's where the violation of expectation method comes along. what you do in the violation of expectation method is you habituate an infant to some physical event. Okay, remember what habituation is. You present it again and again until the infant no longer shows interest in it. And then you determine whether they'll dishabituate to or recover to, i.e., look longer at a possible event that conforms to physical laws or to an impossible event that violates physical laws. And if they dishabituate to an impossible event, that suggests, according to the researchers that engage in this method, that there is an awareness of an aspect of physical reality, that they have some knowledge that, for instance, objects continue to exist. So in this particular example, right, the habituation events involve a carrot moving behind a screen and coming out the other side. So in the two events, you have a short carrot and a tall carrot. And in both cases, they pass behind the screen unseen and come out the other side. So the infants are habituated to that. And then they're presented with these test events, an expected event or a possible event, and an unexpected event or impossible event. And so in the expected event, right, you have the carrot passing behind the screen. Again, it passes behind unseen let me explain really quickly. In the bottom, in B and C, the white box is a cutout in the screen. Okay, so it's a hole in the screen. So in B, a carrot passes behind unseen because it's short enough to pass underneath the cutout. In C, the unexpected event, what happens is the tall carrot passes behind the screen unseen and comes out the other side, and it's unexpected or impossible because you should be able to see the top of the carrot passing behind that cutout in the screen. And what they find is that infants as young as 4 months of age look longer at the unexpected event than at the expected event. And the researchers that do this kind of research interpret that to mean that they have some knowledge of the physical properties of the world, that they understand that they should have seen that carrot pass behind the screen, and if that's the case, they probably have an understanding of object permanence at a much earlier age than Piaget suggested. So on the one hand, this does suggest that Piaget underestimated children's ability. On the other hand, the methodology is so different from what Piaget used that you start to wonder, is the same thing even being measured at all? So those are just questions, to keep in the back of your mind. Newer research suggests, that children are capable of all sorts of things. We talked about facial imitation already. We talked about, we haven't talked about, but at 6 to 9 months of age, children can not only imitate something like a facial expression, but they can actually copy an action that an adult is engaging in with objects. And by 12 to 14 months, they actually can differentiate between an action that is on purpose versus one that is accidental, and they will repeatedly only imitate the purposeful action versus the accidental action. So they're engaging in all sorts of important behaviors that indicate that they have some understanding of the physical properties of the world.